The late sun hung heavy over the plains of Wyoming, spilling amber light across miles of brittle grass that rustled like old secrets. The sky was too quiet and the wind carried more memory than movement. Caleb Ransom stood alone beside a weathered wooden cross hammered into the dry earth at the edge of his land. He didn't bring flowers. He never did. Eleanor had never cared for them in life, and he wasn't about to start lying to her in death. Instead, he tipped his hat with a reverence that bordered on prayer and stared down at the name carved into sun-bleached wood, Eleanor Ransom, beloved wife, 1823 to 1864. He murmured something. Maybe a blessing. Maybe a goodbye. It was hard to tell these days. His voice had grown so quiet even he could barely hear it. The truth was, Caleb hadn't spoken more than a handful of words in years. Not since the war letter came. Not since his son Jameson, a lanky boy with eyes too hopeful for this world, was taken by a bullet somewhere east of the Shenandoah Valley. The day the letter arrived, Caleb read it once, folded it slow, and set it on the mantel. It was still there, yellowed, untouched. His world had since narrowed to creaking floorboards, the scrape of boots on pine, the hiss of wind through loose shutters. He kept to himself, perched on the far edge of Dry Hollow, where the town's gossip rarely reached but its judgment still echoed. They called his ranch haunted, said he'd gone strange, talking to ghosts. But Caleb didn't mind the whispers. Silence had become easier than pretending. The house, like him, leaned with age. Shingles curled, porch boards groaned, and the windows watched the land. With the tiredness of something once proud, now surviving. He moved slow as he returned from the grave to the porch dust curling around his steps. The sky bled orange into the hills. Dusk always came like a memory. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old wood kerosene and the kind of stillness that made you feel like time had given up ticking. One photograph adorned the mantel, Jameson in his Union Blues arm, stiff smile uncertain. Caleb looked at it just long enough to ache, but never long enough to drown. That evening, thunder crouched low on the horizon. The air smelled sharp, metallic, and wet like the breath before a downpour. He lit a single lantern and set a cup of black coffee on the table, letting it steam into the slants. The sky rumbled, the wind picked up, and then a knock. Not soft, not frantic, but measured, firm, deliberate. He froze. No one knocked on his door anymore. The second knock came. Same cadence. Like someone trying to wake a house that had forgotten what it meant to be alive. Caleb rose from his chair, slow, deliberate, his hand brushing against the rifle above the hearth. But he didn't take it down. He opened the door. The storm hadn't broken yet, but lightning forked quietly along the distant ridges. In its flicker stood 10 men, still as statues, their outlines framed by horses shifting restlessly in the wind. They wore worn leathers and wool blankets, their long hair damp from the rising mist. Their presence was like the land immense, unbothered by time, cut from science and smoke. The man at the front was older than the rest. A braid hung over his shoulder, streaked with bone and feather. His face held the deep lines of wind and war. He met Caleb's gaze with unwavering calm. "We ask shelter," he said in slow English, "until the storm passes." Caleb didn't speak at first. He just stared, measuring something older than fear. Behind the man, none of them moved. No weapons drawn, no threats spoken, just waiting. He looked at the sky, then back at the men. "Leave the horses in the barn," he said. "There's hay, water too." The older man bowed his head once. "Thank you." And with that, the house that had known only sorrow and wind now held firelight, breath, and the quiet weight of men history had tried to erase, and for the first time in a long time, Caleb Ransom's silence felt less like a shield and more like a door left open. The storm came slow but heavy, rolling in from the western ridge like an old memory too stubborn to stay buried. The rain hadn't started yet, but the wind snapped through the valley with a wild urgency, lifting dust and loose twigs tugging at the loose tin on the barn roof. Caleb Ransom stood at his kitchen window, fingers wrapped around a chipped mug, eyes fixed on the creeping darkness. It was the kind of storm that didn't just drench the earth, it unearthed things. Feelings, names, wounds, and he wasn't sure if he wanted any of them dug up. That knock still echoed in his mind, measured, calm, as if whoever stood on the porch knew the weight of it. Now they were inside 10 Apache men, most no younger than 30, their faces marked by weather battle and quiet resolve. They moved with a kind of stillness that wasn't still at all, like mountains that knew how to walk. Their leader, Red Hawk, sat closest to the hearth. He hadn't asked again after Caleb opened the door. He hadn't needed to. The respect had been mutual, even if the history between their kinds was anything but. The room, Caleb's kitchen, once the heart of a home, hadn't held this much breath in years. He could feel the shift in the air, like the walls had leaned in to listen. The Apache warriors shed their damp outer layers slowly, carefully, laying blankets by the foot and tending to their boots with worn clothes. Not one of them spoke unless needed. There was no laughter, no boasting, no clamor. Only the soft rustle of fabric, the crackling of the fire, and the ticking of the clock above the mantel that hadn't worked in 3 winters. Caleb moved with deliberate purpose, fetching a dented kettle and pouring what little coffee remained. He didn't have much to give. He hadn't prepared for guests in over a decade, but what he had, he offered. The first tin cup he filled, he handed to Red Hawk. The old man accepted it with a nod, a gesture not of thanks, but of recognition. Caleb sat opposite him, his back to the kitchen door, one boot resting on the rung of the chair rifle still slung loosely against the wall behind him. Just in case, across from him, one of the younger warriors, barely more than a boy, sat cross-legged near the fire. His name, Caleb would later learn, was Chaska, and he carried himself differently from the others, his shoulders a little higher, his eyes a little faster, as if unsure whether to observe or defend. He said nothing for a long time until his gaze drifted upward to the mantel. There in a thin brass frame stood a single photograph, dusty, faded, but unmistakable. A young man in a Union uniform, tall, strong-jawed. His name had once been spoken with pride, Jameson Ransom. The boy pointed. "Your son?" he asked in halting English. Caleb nodded slowly. "Jameson, dead?" the boy asked plainly, not cruelly. "Just honest." "Yeah," Caleb replied, voice rough. "War took him." Chaska looked away, his eyes unreadable. Then without a word, he reached into the leather pouch at his side and pulled something out. A small carved bird made of what looked like turquoise or river-polished slate. It was simple, smooth, weathered by age and fingers. Chaska stood, crossed the room, and placed it gently on the table in front of Caleb. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. Caleb stared at the bird for a long time, his fingers twitching with the urge to touch it, to understand it. He didn't. Not yet. Outside, the wind howled louder, brushing past the windows like a voice long lost in the canyon. Inside, the temperature climbed. The fire did its work. The men began to settle, some against walls, others on bedrolls they'd pulled from their saddlebags. One leaned his head back and breathed deeply, as if inhaling peace for the first time in weeks. Another sharpened a long hunting knife with slow, practiced strokes, the metal hissing softly against the whetstone. And Caleb just watched. These weren't raiders or savages like the newspapers had painted. They weren't threats wrapped in feathers. They were men who had seen too much, lost too much, and expected even less. And maybe that's why Caleb felt something ease in his chest. These men weren't strangers to silence. They carried it like a second skin. Later that night, when the storm finally broke and rain drummed steady on the roof, Caleb brought out a pot of stew he'd meant to save for the week. It was thin, mostly potatoes and bone broth, but it was warm. He ladled it out without looking for thanks, but the nods came anyway. When Red Hawk finally spoke again, his voice was soft but firm. "You lost much," he said. It wasn't a question. "So did you?" Caleb replied. The old chief's eyes glinted in the firelight. "Storms take, but they also clear the land." Caleb didn't say anything to that, but in the quiet that followed, he reached for the carved bird and held it in his palm. It was warm, not from the fire, but from something older. By morning, the air smelled of ash and cedar. The fire had burned low but steady all night, and though the storm had passed, its echo remained in the damp soil and restless sky. Caleb Ransom stepped out onto the porch with a worn blanket over his shoulders and the carved bird still in his pocket. The ranch was unusually still. Inside, the Apache men moved with quiet precision, rolling their blankets, checking gear, tending to boots and blades with the practiced care of men who never stayed too long anywhere. They were not intruding. They were surviving. At the edge of the barn, two of them were already mending a cracked axle on Caleb's old wagon, using rawhide and patience instead of nails. It wasn't asked for. It wasn't spoken about. They just saw something broken and chose to fix it. Caleb stood for a while, watching them, arms crossed, coffee cooling in his cup. No one in Dry Hollow had ever helped him fix anything, not since Eleanor passed. But here were 10 strangers once painted as enemies, moving like they belonged in the rhythm of the land. The moment fractured when hoofbeats rang out from the ridge. A lone rider crested the hill, Deputy Hank Mercer, his gray gelding kicking dust into the wind. Caleb didn't move. He stayed on the porch, boots anchored into the floorboards like roots. The Apache noticed too. Red Hawk appeared beside the barn, arms folded, expression unreadable. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't need to. Hank pulled up just short of the front gate, one hand resting near his pistol, the other tugging the reins tight. "You got company, Ransom," he called, voice flat with suspicion. Caleb sipped his coffee. "Storm rolled through last night. House was dry." Hank's eyes narrowed. He was a man who didn't like riddles unless he was the one speaking them. His gaze shifted to the edge of the porch rail, where a colorful woven blanket, still damp from last night's storm, hung across the railing to dry. His jaw set. "You shelterin' Apaches out here?" Caleb didn't flinch. "They knocked," I answered. "You know what folks'll say." Caleb turned his head, slightly, gaze meeting the deputy's. "They've been talking about me for 10 years, Hank. Ain't said anything useful yet." There was a flicker of hesitation in the younger man's posture, but it passed quick. "You remember what happened down near Red Feather Crossing last winter? Family got burned out. They blamed Apache raiders. Could be some of these boys were part of it." Caleb stepped down from the porch, slow, deliberate. And what if they weren't? What if they were just riding through like you or me, looking for dry land and a fire? You don't know that. "I don't," Caleb agreed. "But I do know they've been here 2 nights and not one rifle's been raised. Not a thing's been taken. Only thing I've seen is a busted wagon wheel getting mended." Hank glanced toward the barn again, uncertain. "Town's nervous. Some folks think you've changed." Caleb let out a breath. "Maybe I have." A silence settled over them, the kind of pause that had weight. Eventually, Hank tugged the reins and turned the gelding. "You're stirring something dangerous, Caleb. Just be sure it's worth it." As he rode off, the wind picked up behind him, whistling through the cottonwoods like a warning wrapped in prayer. Caleb watched until the deputy disappeared behind the ridge. When he turned, Red Hawk was there, arms still crossed, but his eyes now softer. "They will come again," the chief said, "with more mouths. fewer questions. Caleb nodded. I reckon. Back inside, the fire was still warm. Chaska, the youngest warrior, sat near the hearth, his blanket tight around his shoulders. He looked paler than before, breath shallow, a sheen of sweat across his brow. The coughing had returned during the night, sharper this time. Caleb knelt beside him, felt his forehead, then rose and fetched a small pot of steeped willow bark tea. He poured a measure into a tin cup, knelt again, and handed it over. Chaska looked at him with surprise, then quiet gratitude. My boy coughed like that once, Caleb said gently. Thought it was dust from the cattle. Turned out to be something worse. We didn't have what we needed in time. The boy nodded, sipping carefully. That afternoon, Reverend Ezra Cole rode in from town, his coat flapping in the breeze and his face pulled tight with worry. He tied his horse to the post and climbed the steps without ceremony. I came to talk, the preacher said. Not to warn, appreciated, Caleb replied. They sat on the porch together, the Reverend nursing a cup of coffee, staring out at the barn where Red Hawk and his men worked in silence. Word's out, Ezra said finally. It's spreading faster than a dry fire. Town's uneasy. Some of them are talking about taking action. Caleb looked toward the horizon. Then let them talk. You know they won't stop at talk. I do. Ezra watched him for a long moment. I stood at your wife's grave with you, Caleb. I remember what you were like before. You were kind but quiet. Caleb met his gaze. Kind and quiet is what got my son killed. Maybe it's time I learned a new way to be. Ezra didn't argue. He just nodded, slow and full of sorrow. They'll come, Caleb. Caleb stood. Then I'll be ready. Inside, the tea cooled in the cup. Chaska slept now, curled under 2 blankets. The carved bird still sat on the mantel beside Jameson's photo. And for the first time in a long time, the silence in the house didn't feel like absence. It felt like protection. The wind died by dusk, and the stillness it left behind was unnerving. Not peaceful, but tense, like the world itself was holding its breath. Caleb Ransom stood at the kitchen window with the lantern turned low, eyes on the far fence line where nothing moved but the slow flicker of twilight. The house had been bracing itself all day, every board and beam taut with the memory of what was coming. He could feel it in his ribs. This wasn't just a storm of rumor anymore. It was coming with boots fire and fear. Inside, the Apache men moved with quiet purpose. Their movements were precise, practiced, no wasted motion. They had fortified houses before, not their own. Not with walls like this, but they understood defense. Red Hawk and 2 others shifted the heavy oak table to form cover near the front window. Chaska, still pale and weakened, had been moved gently to the root cellar beneath the floorboards, wrapped in wool and flannel with a lantern beside him. Caleb had sat with him earlier, pressing the carved bird into his hand. Hold on to this, he'd said, voice low. It's carried 1 life already. Might carry yours. The boy hadn't spoken, but the grip of his fingers had answered. By the time night finally settled over the valley, there were no stars, only a thick curtain of black, pierced now and then by the flaring glow of oil lamps inside. Reverend Ezra Cole had returned on foot, rifle slung over one shoulder, Bible tucked under his arm. He didn't preach that night. He simply nodded, took a spot by the back door, and checked his rifle once, then again. You sure about this? He asked Caleb as they stood on the porch in the cool dark. Caleb nodded, gaze fixed on the ridgeline. I buried my son without knowing if he was scared or brave when the bullet found him, he said. I ain't making that mistake again, not for anyone. Then came the torches. First 1, then 3, then a dozen more flared to life along the ridge, winding down like a trail of fire ants. They moved slowly, deliberately, lighting the path ahead with menace more than need. The horses that carried them snorted and pawed the earth. Faces hidden behind bandanas and hats, the riders advanced without a word. Caleb counted them 11 men, all local. Boys grown mean with fear and stories they'd never had to question. He didn't see Deputy Hank Mercer among them. Maybe even Hank had known this would go too far. Or maybe he'd chosen to let others do what he wouldn't. The man at the front wore a long coat and a wide hat pulled low. He raised his voice just enough to be heard across the yard. "We're not here for blood. Just want the Apaches out. Send 'em out and no harm done." Caleb didn't move. Behind him, Red Hawk stepped beside him like a shadow, tall and unmoving. "They leave at first light," Caleb replied. "Not before." "That ain't your call," the man shouted back. "It's my house, my land. So yeah, it is." There was a pause, the kind that hangs heavy before a strike. "You know what they are," the man said. "What they've done." Caleb stepped forward 1 pace. "I know what they haven't done here." The men shifted in their saddles. A few glanced around, suddenly unsure. One torch was raised higher. "You're gonna regret this, Ransom. I've lived with regret for 20 years, got room for one more." The torch sailed through the air. A second later, an arc of fire trailing through the night sky. It hit the side of the barn, caught instantly. Dry hay and old timber went up like paper. Flames clawed upward, turning red into roaring gold. Before Caleb could react, another rider leveled his shotgun and fired. The shot splintered the porch rail. Caleb dropped to a knee and squeezed his trigger once. The crack of his rifle was sharp and true. The rider fell from his horse. The torch in his hand extinguished in dirt. Screams erupted. Horses reared. Then the warriors emerged, not from behind Caleb, but from the shadows of the barn and outbuildings, silent and swift, their bows drawn, knives in hand, eyes like steel. They didn't yell. They didn't threaten. They simply stood, and it was enough. The invaders faltered. Another rider tried to swing a rifle around, but an arrow thudded into the dirt inches from his boot. The Reverend raised his rifle and fired once, not to kill, but to scatter. The report echoed across the hills like thunder. The illusion of power shattered. The riders fled in disarray, dropping torches, reins, even weapons. One fell hit by his own panicked horse. Another dropped to his knees and raised his hands, but no one moved to hurt him. Within minutes it was over. The barn still burned, but the warriors had already pulled the horses free. Beat back the fire with buckets from the well, soaked the roof to stop it from spreading. The flames hissed and died in patches. Caleb leaned against the porch post, breathing hard. A graze on his shoulder, burned hot blood soaking into his sleeve, but he was alive. Red Hawk stood beside him, blade in one hand. Gaze locked on the darkness where the attackers had fled. "They won't return tonight," he said quietly. "They shouldn't have come at all," Caleb muttered. Behind them, Reverend Cole sat down on the steps, head bowed. "Lord, forgive us," he whispered, "for what we nearly became." The fire crackled low, and inside the cellar, Chaska stirred alive, still breathing, the bird carving clutched to his chest. By dawn, the flames had reduced to whispers. What remained of the barn smoldered like the last breath of a storm, its blackened beams standing crooked in the light of morning. Smoke curled toward a pale blue sky, and the land around Caleb Ransom's ranch was hushed, not with fear but with a kind of reverence. No blood had soaked the soil, not this time. No one had died who hadn't come seeking violence. It was the quiet after choosing mercy over mayhem. A rare kind of silence. Inside the house, Chaska stirred beneath the cellar quilt. He blinked slowly, then turned toward the lantern beside him. Caleb knelt at the trapdoor above and offered a thin smile. "It's morning," Caleb said. "You're still here?" The boy nodded, voice still rough. "You didn't let them burn me?" "No," Caleb replied. Wasn't there fire to light? Chaska coughed weakly and sat up with effort. His hand clutched something wrapped in cloth. When he opened it, he found a strip of embroidery, sun-faded but lovingly stitched. Tiny blue flowers danced along its edge, sewn with imperfect hands. It was something Eleanor had made long ago, before the war, before the silence. A piece of home not meant to survive, but somehow it had. My wife made that, Caleb explained. She said it kept Jameson safe on long rides. Maybe it'll do the same for you. The boy pressed the fabric to his chest and nodded, eyes glinting with something between reverence and awe. Upstairs, the Apache warriors moved with purpose. They packed bedrolls, secured blades, and checked saddles with the quiet rhythm of men who knew departure was always part of shelter. They had stayed longer than expected, long enough to be seen and nearly long enough to be punished for it. But they had not left in fear. They would leave with their heads high and their dignity intact. Red Hawk, standing near the window, watched the last smoke curl into the open sky. He turned to Caleb, who had come back in from the cellar, brushing soot from his palms. "You saved the boy," the chief said. Caleb shook his head gently. "I just gave him time. He did the rest. You gave more than time." Caleb didn't answer. He didn't have to. Together they stepped onto the porch. The breeze had returned, soft and cool, stirring the long grass around the pasture. The horses stood ready near the rebuilt fence, tended through the night by warriors who refused to sleep until the last flame was out and the last animal safe. Caleb walked alongside them as they gathered their gear. No words were spoken at first. There was no need. Something unspoken had passed between these men during the fire, something stronger than gratitude, something forged in shared defiance. When Chaska emerged from the house, pale but standing, a hush fell across the yard. He moved carefully, cradling the cloth strip in his hand. The carved bird still nestled in his pocket. One of the older warriors stepped forward to help him mount, but the boy shook his head, choosing to climb on his own. The effort was slow but deliberate. Caleb stepped forward with a small bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. Inside was a tin cup, half a pouch of dried apples, and a scrap of parchment tucked with care. On it, written in his weathered scrawl, were simple instructions. "If fever returns, steep bark. 3 times a day. Rest in shade. Drink more than you think you need." The boy took it with both hands, studying Caleb with quiet intensity. "You kept me alive," he said. Caleb nodded. "You reminded me what that means." It was then that Red Hawk stepped forward. He held a small object in his weathered hand, wrapped in tanned deer hide. As he opened it, the light caught the dark grain of wood, a carved hawk in flight, wings wide, etched with precise lines, and a single bead of turquoise for its eye. He placed it in Caleb's palm. "This is for you," Red Hawk said, "to remind you that even broken wings still remember the sky." Caleb turned it over in his hand, thumb brushing the curve of the wing. "You carved this," Red Hawk nodded. "After my own son died. It helped me breathe again." For a long moment, Caleb couldn't speak. His throat tightened and he simply closed his fingers around the carving. The warriors mounted one by one. Their horses stood steady, as if sensing the weight of goodbye. Chaska rode near the front, his head held high. As they turned to leave, Caleb stepped to the gate and raised one hand. Not to wave them off, but to hold space, to mark the moment with something deeper than words. As they rode into the horizon, 10 shadows against a rising sun, the land held its breath again. But this time it wasn't fear. It was a kind of reverence, a sacred stillness. Behind him, the house bore the scent of smoke and sweat and healing. The broken parts of the barn would take time, but the fence had already been mended. Caleb would rebuild, not because he had to, but because now finally he wanted to. Reverend Ezra Cole approached from the pasture, his boots damp with dew. He stood beside Caleb in silence, both men watching the riders vanish into the distance. "You ever think you'd fight for people you didn't know?" Ezra asked gently. Caleb's voice was soft. They weren't strangers, just hadn't been given a chance to be known. The Reverend nodded. "What now?" Caleb looked down at the carving in his hand. He didn't smile, but something about him lightened. "Fix the barn, plant something, maybe leave the door open more often." Ezra clasped his shoulder once, then walked back toward town, leaving Caleb alone at the fence line. But he didn't feel alone. Later that night, Caleb sat by the hearth with Eleanor's shawl draped over his shoulders and the carved hawk on the table beside him. The fire glowed low, casting gold against the walls. He didn't talk to ghosts that night. He didn't need to. Instead, he whispered into the stillness, "I thought silence kept me safe, but it just kept me alone." Outside, the wind stirred gently, and for the first time in years, Caleb Ransom left the front door open just in case someone else needed to knock. In the weeks that followed, the smoke faded, but the memory remained woven into every scorched board and mended rail. The barn was rebuilt one beam at a time, slower than before, but with hands steadier, more deliberate. Caleb Ransom worked mostly alone, though once or twice a quiet soul from town would drop by offering a tool or a coil of rope. Not because they agreed with what he'd done, but because the fire had forced them to reckon with something they couldn't unsee: a man who didn't flinch, didn't beg, and didn't break when righteousness came riding in, torchlit and cruel. They stopped whispering about ghosts after that. Or if they did, they spoke softer, like maybe the ghosts deserved to be there. The house didn't change much. It still leaned in the wind, still creaked in the floors, but it breathed easier. The carved hawk stayed on the mantel beside Jameson's photograph. Eleanor's shawl remained draped across the rocker near the hearth. The photo was still there too, but now Caleb looked at it without bracing himself. The grief was still there, but no longer sharpened. It had softened at the edges like wood worn down by years of wind and touch. He started writing letters. Not many. Just one or two sent east to a cousin, to a friend of Jameson's. Simple things: "Hope this finds you. Spring's coming late. I've got apples near blooming again." He hadn't sent a letter in a decade, but something about giving the words a place to land made him feel less like the last tree in a dying orchard. Sometimes children passed by the ranch on their way to the lower fields. One day a little girl paused near the fence and pointed to the 10 stones arranged in a circle just beyond the porch. Not headstones, markers, each one carved with a small symbol: a feather, a sun, a hoofprint, a hawk in flight. She asked if it was a graveyard. Caleb, sitting on the steps with coffee in hand, replied gently, "No, honey. That's memory. It's what you leave when you want folks to remember who mattered." Word spread that he had opened the house again, not to strangers but to travelers. Men between ranches, women with children, and no place else. He didn't charge them, just pointed to the second cabin, the one he built in silence that fall with his own 2 hands beside the cottonwoods. It wasn't much, but it was warm. It was enough. Some say Reverend Ezra Cole preached different after that fire. Softer, more honest. He talked less about wrath and more about windows, how they let the light in if you dared to open them. He once said at a wedding, "The hardest thing a man can do is stay when it would be easier to run. And the holiest thing he can do is listen before he judges." No one asked what he meant. They knew. Caleb Ransom never remarried. He didn't need to. He had already loved the kind of woman who planted stories in linen and cooked hope into bread. And somehow she never really left. When the wind moved a certain way, you could still hear him say her name, not in grief but in gratitude. And if you ever passed through that stretch of Wyoming in the years after, folks would point you to a worn fence with a rusted hinge and a porch that still creaked in welcome. They'd say that's where the Apaches stayed, where fire didn't win, where a man didn't wait on permission to do what was right, and if you knocked, they say the door still opens. Because once long ago a man realized it wasn't silence that kept him safe, it was silence that kept him lonely. And once that door opened, he never closed it again. Sometimes the world teaches us to close doors to guard what's left after loss, to lock away the broken pieces, to stay silent in the name of safety. But healing doesn't live behind locked doors. It begins the moment we open them. Caleb Ransom was a man who had buried a son, mourned a wife, and let silence become his shelter. He didn't open his door because he was brave. He opened it because something in him remembered what it felt like to be human, to hurt, to hope. And in that simple act, offering shelter to those the world feared, he rediscovered what it meant to belong. This story reminds us that we don't need to be warriors or preachers to stand for what's right. Sometimes all it takes is a hot cup of coffee, a place near the fire, and the willingness to say, "You're safe here." True courage isn't loud. It doesn't always ride in with rifles and lawmen. Often it whispers in quiet places when you protect someone. Others condemn when you rebuild after the fire, when you choose connection over comfort. We all carry wounds. Some are visible, most are not. But when we allow others in, especially those who look different, speak different, believe different, something shifts. The silence lifts, the light changes, the land breathes easier. So if you're hurting, don't let the silence harden you. And if someone knocks, whether with words, with eyes, or with trembling hands, open the door. Because sometimes the greatest act of redemption isn't what you fight against. It's what you choose to welcome in. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of the quiet strength found in kindness or the power of opening your door when the world tells you to lock it, then you belong here with us. At Frontier Reverie, we share stories where silence speaks, redemption rides in slow, and healing happens one honest act at a time. Subscribe to the channel for more Western tales of courage, compassion, and second chances. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters here. And if this story meant something to you, share it with someone who might need that reminder that the fire doesn't have to win and we're never too far gone to start again. Until next time, keep the porch light on.